I've always been too much of a people pleaser, a bit of a pushover, but I'm a real hard ass when it comes to what I spend my free time on. Video games, for instance, really have to pull me in, or I'm going to bounce off them hard and go on to something else. But I'm not immune to changing my mind if I get a new perspective. Case in point, I thought The Outer Worlds was shallow and derivative for years until I replayed it on a hunch that I'd like it more after finishing Starfield. And I was right. It's still not a masterpiece, but I came to appreciate its conciseness and simplicity in the face of Starfield's mile-wide, inch-deep scope. But even with this refreshed point of view, Obsidian still had a lot to prove with their next RPGs, or this sunny-side-up mentality would be short-lived. I grew a little worried when Avowed's trailers looked more like The Outer Worlds with swords, especially since The Outer Worlds had already felt like we have Fallout at home.
Something wrong?
Fortunately, my fears were mostly misplaced, as both Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2, despite some unfortunate missteps, surpassed my admittedly tepid expectations.
Whatever you came here to find, I'd say you found it.
But there were others that were, less impressed, let's say. The ever-dissatisfied anti-woke mob tore these games up for months, and even the more rational discourse was still pretty vitriolic as numerous players decried Obsidian's recent efforts as shallow and unbefitting of the studio's legacy. Even Daniel Vavra, the writer and director of the other big 2025 RPG, In Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, said that The Outer Worlds was a 7 out of 10, but that it did nothing new, and was just a bunch of, quote, loot boxes, maintenance shafts, loading screens, and level grinding in a static scripted world. Skill-up like parts of Avowed, but even he claimed that
ultimately though it kind of just feels like content. Like it's the Netflix show you watch while you're folding your laundry, or it's the game that you play while you're waiting for a better game to come along.
Now, are these guys just doing a Quentin Tarantino and punching down for no apparent reason? I don't think so. I don't agree with the severity of their criticisms, but I understand where they're coming from because it speaks to my own misgivings. Maybe it's the people pleaser in me.
Is that true?
Well...
Or maybe, I have to be honest with myself that as good as these games can be, Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2 can still feel like cold pizza games. They're still quite good because their core ingredients are so delicious, but they're not quite as hot and fresh as they could be.
He's trying to bewitch us with weird words!
These games teeter on the edge of greatness, but seem afraid to make that risky but oh so rewarding leap. And that's too bad, because they come so far in pursuing it. Ironically, Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2 would likely be the perfect version of themselves if they just took notes from each other and combined all their best aspects into one ultimate megazord of an Obsidian RPG, like how The Outer Worlds 2 could incorporate more platforming into its big worlds, or a better ending like Avowed has, or how Avowed could benefit from The Outer Worlds 2's pacing and far more concise writing.
Forgive me, again.
So let's figure out what the ultimate 2025 Obsidian RPG would look like by appreciating the triumphs that these two games achieved, and then analyzing where and how they could improve for future sequels. Long story short, if you love that Starfield Outer Worlds video I made a little while back, you're going to love this one. And if you do end up loving this one, please click all the buttons for me and check out my Patreon while you're at it. I would be eternally grateful.
This is a huge step in our relationship, and I want everything to be perfect.
So without further ado, let's get stuck in.
One for you!
Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2 had tough jobs. The Outer Worlds 2 had a lot of RPG fans to win back after a quite vocal chapter wrote off the first game as a shallow and uninspired Fallout clone. Avowed looking like The Outer Worlds with swords, as one YouTube commenter said, was not going to do it any favors either. And while I was much more optimistic about The Outer Worlds 2 based on its trailers, Avowed just looked weird to me. First it was darker, moodier Elder Scrolls, and then it became blindingly bright and oversaturated. And I'm sorry, but the ape sapien looking lizard people are nightmare fuel.
What are you gonna do with it?
And oh my god, old Kai voice actor jump scare, sorry about that. And since I'd never played the two previous Pillars of Eternity games, there was no serious nostalgia for Obsidian to appeal to either, so I relied much more on my love of a similar RPG in Greedfall to sell myself on this naturally beautiful world full of rival factions and nature gods. But thankfully, though it took a while for me to ingratiate myself to this kind of cheery, cheesy world, I started to relinquish my cynicism once the full power of Unreal 5 kicked in and started complimenting the fittingly magical score. The prominent mushrooms and other glowing vegetation made the world feel brimming with mysterious life. The mountain crags looked like you could reach out and touch their gritty textures, and the insane draw distance promised that, like any good Bethesda game, whatever you can see is somewhere you can go. The voice work is solid, though it can sometimes struggle to dignify the excessive lore jargon and sometimes critical critical role-level humor. Now, the writing has its moments, but it took a while for me to start enjoying the world instead of feeling like I was being indoctrinated into some toxic positivity cult.
Thank the gods. For a second there, I thought I had a problem on my hands.
It doesn't help that the character models outside of perhaps Kai have this kind of low-budget indie movie look to them where their facial hair is glued onto stiff mannequin faces.
A novel idea, that. What I need is a stronger power source.
I'm actually surprised how many of them look like placeholder work-in-progress models, and how much better The Outer Worlds 2 looks despite releasing only 8 months later. Speaking of The Outer Worlds 2, the planets are now much more wide open and free-flowing, and as a Hoth man, I really dig the frosty planet Cloister, which felt particularly inhospitable and atmospheric. Overall, The Outer Worlds 2 visuals are sleek as otter butts, and the lighting is divine. The emphasis on heavy shadows and highly saturated colors in the sequel makes this world come alive in a way I've not enjoyed since Rapture and Bioshock. Most importantly, the sequel's art design finally feels fully realized and distinctive. There's a much more retro-futuristic vibe here that dabbles in the whole atomic age meets steampunk feeling, like you're on the set of Doctor Who. From the old-timey spectacles characters wear to the big Tesla-esque energy tubes and iconography. This, in tandem with a distinct pageantry for each area and faction, grants this world a much more majestic feel than the first game, which often felt too visually conservative outside of its skyboxes. And while the environments are pretty breathtaking, especially in comparison to Obsidian's previous work, what really stood out to me from both games is how much more involved your exploration through them is. Unlike The Outer Worlds, which was organized more into big lanes, somewhat like Metal Gear Solid 5 was, Avowed feels miles wide and miles tall. Avowed is quite vertical when it wants to be, dialing in a Far Cry or Dying Light-esque level of climbable, swimmable, and breakable structures hiding loot chests, potions, and stray weapons. Throw in the occasional MSIM-esque puzzle that lets you use your ice magic to freeze water into a platform to get up higher, or supercharge a generator to open a door, and you've got a level of interactivity that goes beyond any other title of its ilk in ways that don't just feel like key lock designs, even though they definitely are. All game design is of course a trick, but the best tricks are the ones that you can tell are in your own best interest so that you don't care how contrived they may be. Speaking of contrived, Avowed has caught a lot of heat for how dead its cities feel, like how NPCs tend to just stand around waiting for you to talk to them, and how you can steal stuff from under people's noses and no one ever cares.
You, what are you doing? This is a crime scene!
And to be fair, this is likely just an artifact of the game's origins as an MMO, and it's also a residual effect of the only frame of reference most people have for these things being the Elder Scrolls approach to thievery and law enforcement backlash. I can see why people would dislike a lack of reactivity here, but assuming that every game has to be a 1-to-1 ratio simulator of real life, it's also a huge problem with games criticism these days. It seems that if a game doesn't go out of its way to have outrageous levels of random events and micro-granular detail like a Red Dead Redemption 2, the Twitter chuds think X game is bad. But this is a myopic standard of quality for many reasons, chief among them that not every game gets better simply by simulating every incidental detail of whatever reality is on screen. Dante may burn a lot of calories juggling demons, but no one's asking for Devil May Cry to add in a hunger system so that we can realistically keep up his energy levels to maintain such a high juggling ratio, are we? Ultimately, this lack of reactivity doesn't matter much. You don't spend much time in civilization anyway, and when you do, you still have a lot of verticality to your exploration, whether it's back alley scaffolding, wooden barriers that hide treasure, or the occasional roof run to find some items the birds have stolen from a vendor. Obsidian makes the average vendor run a little bit more interesting by making your routes to get there more natural and indirect and less gamey anyway, so there's really not a ton to complain about. Now, notably, The Outer Worlds 2 hasn't gotten the same criticism. That's both because it has far more interior areas that mask the NPCs standing still all by themselves, but it also has a quite lively and robust number of different things happening in the wilds too that Avowed just simply doesn't have. For instance, in just a 100-foot stretch or so, I found an abandoned camp, then a crashed train car with loot, then a small cave adorned with cult imagery about a thief holed up and waiting for his lover who met an unfortunate end, and then, nearby, a lookout tower with nice armor and guns. Each area is so handcrafted and full of intentional reward for doing the game the service of just checking out every nook and cranny that the developers put together. The environments also don't betray what's around the corner, so you genuinely have to go in there, figure out what it is, and take it in as you go. And in a turn slightly similar to, let's say, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, objectives aren't just represented by markers anymore, but by general zones where you have to mill around that area of interest and actually find the thing you're looking for instead of just being pointed to it with an actual marker right above it. This means that you don't just sprint to the next blip on your radar and turn your brain off, but actually engage the spaces. And while exploring, I even saw these really nice, seemingly incidental occurrences like bands of NPCs running around on some mission that didn't seem connected to any quest or concerned me in any way, but just contributed to a sense that the world isn't waiting for me to come to it before it starts performing. I was just super pleased with how much more rewarding and varied exploration is in this game than the Outer Worlds. And as for indoor exploration, well, sorry Daniel Vavra, I actually like the vent crawling in this game. It scratched that immersive sim itch for me, but it is, admittedly, kind of a gimmick without much range of choice. You will crawl through vents probably no less than 20 to 30 times in this game, and you're basically just taking the vent to go find the occasional secret area or just bypass combat entirely. So it becomes a little bit of a design crutch by the end. But much like how Avowed's NPCs and cities feel stiff, but not, game damaging, this is one of those, well, if it's fun enough, who needs it to be great kind of things. It's here because it's a tried and true mechanic, and it's fun to do, so let's not make it a bigger deal than it is. I'd also like to point out something that the Outer Worlds 2 does that none of Bethesda's first-person games have really done to date, and that's have actual environmental puzzles. None of them are brain busters, but they are involved, some being these Rube Goldberg-like conventions trying to get a ball to make its way through a maze, while another has you trying to suss out a code whose answers lie in the planetarium around you. These are fun and much more engaging than most of its competition in the RPG genre. I do have one quibble with the Outer Worlds 2's exploration. I'm surprised that the Outer Worlds 2, unlike Avowed, abandons the promising platforming and climbing outside of the first couple hours. Whereas Avowed makes it somewhat gamey looking loot drops engaging because of how much climbing, jumping, and swimming it takes to get to them, the Outer Worlds 2 just kinda has you walking up to most of them on a horizontal plane or snaking your way to them through the vent systems. Early on in the main quest, there's a reasonably challenging little platforming puzzle, but most of the time you're just mantling over slightly higher or lower stuff for the remainder of the journey. It feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to not make the interactivity match the grandeur of how these worlds look, especially outdoors. And while the planet design is finally more interesting and varied, there's more than a few times you're just kind of hoofing it through empty snow waste a bit longer than is interesting and wishing you had a little more to do than just sprint. But I am encouraged overall that both of these games seem to be doing more than the Outer Worlds despite some exploration. The Outer Worlds 2 rewarding you for your build craft, and Avowed granting you a surprising amount of tactile feedback and reward. So mad kudos there. But hey, even if you're like Daniel Vavra and you think this shit sucks, it's all really just tasty icing on the cake anyway because Obsidian's really leveled up their combat models, and I'd argue that these are the main attraction here, especially in Avowed's case. So in Avowed, we roam around this wide open world and pick fights with various bosses and trash mobs, often outside of big clearings but also inside of a lot of caves. The MMO design shines through here yet again, and while the roaming bands of baddies or the bosses don't look particularly natural just walking in circles in their prescribed zones until you alert them, you won't care much because engaging them is such a, engaging challenge. Combat feels very much like Dying Light with magic. You have a stamina bar that your dodges and attacks, both magic and melee, draw from. You've got to be careful not to drain it and leave yourself open to attack while it's recharging. But this isn't just a first-person Souls-like. You've also got two swappable loadouts that you can mix and match just about any combo of magic wands, one or two-handed melee weapons, shields, or guns. Not to mention all the magic spells you can learn, special supplemental powers that you acquire from the main story, and a whole host of consumables to boost your resiliency and damage output. Magic attacks are amplified by wands, and attacking with them looks and feels a lot like Hogwarts Legacy, down to the heavy controller vibrations as you attack with flourish. Spells can be absolutely devastating, and many of them look incredible exploding across the screen. Now, all the guns are of the flintlock variety that requires a reload after each shot, so they were never my weapon of choice unless I was trying to exploit the enemy AI from some distant perch they couldn't get to, but still it was cool that they were included. I love these types of old school weapons. Melee attacks, on the other hand, are very impactful with a bit full of hit stopping, and you can charge up their attacks for some big damage. You can also throw various types of grenades that do damage and status effects as well as greatly increasing the yellow bars underneath enemy health bars that once full from accrued damage, stagger them for a limited time, so you can swoop in and pull off a devastating combo that takes off huge chunks of their health. It's a really fun subgame within combat, and I found the melee options were the most conducive to chaining damage into finisher moves. That rush of impactful and varied combat that lets you employ all manner of abilities like summoning a bear to your aid or refreshing your stamina just feels great. Combat is colorful, visceral, and full of feedback, and I can't tell you how much I randomly enjoyed fighting the bears in this game. game. I would advise you though not to make the same mistake I did and leave the awful default 30 FPS quality mode on. Switch that shit to 60 FPS immediately, which makes this game go from feeling janky and slow to pretty darn slick. It even ups the input speed of skipping through dialogue, which is nice. Now, the caveats I have with the combat model is how damage spongy your enemies can be, how stingy the amount of upgrade points are that you can barely see the, full roster of abilities you'd want to use, and how clunky and junky the UI and menus are. The inventory screen alone has different tabs for weapons, armor, consumables, valuables, crafting materials, and more, many of which aren't relevant until you're at a vendor anyways. Your in-game pause menu has a huge radial wheel, divided into godlike powers, icons for one of each of the major 3 classes, and which require to drill into each if you've gotten more than 2 abilities inside of a particular class. You've also got your companion abilities to siphon through, and all of your consumables, of which there are often 5 to 10 options, and many of which are fairly redundant with your health and magic potions you've already got, and more. Switching between all these is often just too much to do. It's something you have to take advantage of if you're just leaving positive buffs on the table, but it's just not very enjoyable to be obligated to click through all of this stuff to keep the upper hand in battle. As for leveling up itself, the ability screen has about 25 to 27 different abilities per each of the 3 class categories. Because ability points are doled out so seldomly, and because each ability has 3 levels to it requiring a point each, you can really only get about 5 or 6 abilities maxed out anyway. Getting any more means that you're a jack of many trades, and you may not master enough to be any better in combat. Worst of all, getting to them inside the in-combat menus gets even messier if you actually diversify your portfolio. But one thing to note here too is don't think you're obligated to stay in one class, and make sure you look through all the different class types. As long as you've got the points, you can choose any one of them. And I found that there were some that were kind of unintuitively cordoned off in different places. I, for instance, thought that one-handed weaponry would be all up under the warrior class, and so I missed out on buffing up the one weapon type I actually used in the game because I was just never looking at the ranger screen. I also found some really sweet combos like raining down hail on my enemies till they froze and then smashing into them for huge damage with my charge attack, sometimes just cracking them into ice cubes. Though, admittedly, this was about the only combo that I employed the whole game outside of summoning the occasional bear. Most everything else required a much higher investment into the systems than it seemed like I had points to spend or ever found in the environment or at vendors to actually upgrade to. Fortunately, what keeps the fun but ultimately a little repetitive combat a bit fresher is chasing upgrade parts to craft your gear into more powerful versions of itself. Herbs and materials are everywhere, so pick them up or break down old stuff to secure their chase components so that you can make your decent stuff actually really good. I'm actually kind of convinced that I really had a mediocre starting gear that I stuck with for most of the game, but I was able to hang with the difficulty through sheer upgrade persistence alone. The second Outer Worlds carries this crafting emphasis over too, though it's certainly less of a factor than before. Sure, you can craft a lot of upgrades in theory, but I never seem to have enough materials to make more than just sort of the same generic stuff. And the huge variety of guns with mods already attached ensured that most of my work was done for me, and usually the versatility of what I found made up for the lack of incremental damage via crafting upgrades. While I only seemed to get good maces in Avowed, in Outer Worlds 2 I was constantly swapping out a new gun or finding some new iteration of a pistol that shot rockets or plasma or had some other cool effect slotted into it. It really felt like what the Borderlands series has always promised but never quite fulfilled for me. And if the variety wasn't enticing enough, the gameplay just feels really, really good this time around with only a couple quibbles. Now, the Outer Worlds shooting and smacking wasn't bad, mind you, and sometimes it could be quite satisfying, but it did have a pretty bad hit detection problem that kept the combat from ever feeling consistently fun or effective over long periods. That same hit detection problem persists here in a slightly different form, admittedly, but hip firing does seem to help. The sequel, though, adds a lot more depth to the combat by making elemental damage matter. For instance, plasma tears through organics, and you'll want to keep a shock weapon on hand for all the robots who go from a bullet sponge nightmare if you're using bullets, to a fun kick in the teeth moment where you short circuit them out and stun lock them with shock damage. But most simply, the guns are just way better in this game. A plasma SMG could melt hordes of guys, or this shotgun coated in ice could do massive frost damage. I even leaned on this low-level 3-barreled shotgun with incendiary damage to evaporate enemies for way longer than it should have been good. I regularly found the combat to be way too swingy in the original Outer Worlds, and to rarely have enough ammo, even though I bought everything at every vendor. But here, not only did I have plenty of ammo, if I ever ran out, it was actually not a detriment, but a privilege to be able to just whip out something else in my inventory and get to use that instead. Now, being primarily a shooter, the interface and combat design is likely going to be inherently much simpler in the Outer Worlds 2 versus the almost CRPG level of complexity that Avowed has. But I do want to give credit to the simplicity of the menus and the UI nonetheless. You also get various grenades like you'd expect, but you can now switch between several gadgets. Your time dilation ability returning from the first game, a rechargeable acid blast in close that does a little damage, and a really cool X-ray vision mask that lets you see points of interest in NPCs through walls, which can let you solve puzzles or avoid hazards. It's a really cool idea, though I'm surprised that you get this fairly early on and there's no other gadget that shows up to supplement it. The complete removal of the underused disguise mechanic from the first game, though, is really unexpected. It seems like exactly the kind of mechanic that could just blossom in a sequel because it was almost there from a gameplay perspective in the first game and just underused. I'd also like to point out the pretty weird difficulty curve in The Outer Worlds 2 that doesn't exist in Avowed. Avowed's combat problem is that you never unlock enough abilities to make combat much more than firing off a couple abilities, clicking attack 5 times and then firing them off again. And even if you did have more abilities, it'd make switching between all of them even more tedious than it already is. Avowed's always pretty challenging, or at least taxing in that you're always moving, always paying attention to cooldowns, and trying to use your AoE attacks and synergies to do the most damage the fastest or avoid damage the longest. The problem with The Outer Worlds 2 is that the difficulty curve is way off. Early on, you've barely got any inhaler charges to heal, everything seems to hone in on you and you alone and kill you in a couple hits, so you're just reloading your saves over and over again, grinding through these areas. But then you hit a point by about level 15 to 20 where all of a sudden you've got so many buffs and debuffs active that the enemies never seem to target you, they only pay attention to your stupid companions, and you have such powerful weapons that nothing stands in your way and the game becomes a bit of a cakewalk. I also found that generally speaking, there are way too few enemies to shoot with all of your cool weapons, so fights just end too fast. They're too fun, and they don't last long enough to be even more fun. But regardless, the versatility of your weaponry and its satisfying feedback was much appreciated, especially in contrast to the obnoxious complexity to keep up with in Avowed. But keeping in mind that Avowed's a bit of a combat sandbox and The Outer Worlds 2 could just be seen as kind of a shooter or a hack and slash game, The Outer Worlds 2's advantage is that it actually makes your character build matter to more than just fighting. Avowed has no security skill, for instance, just a required amount of lockpicks to open a thing, or you can sometimes find a key to circumvent this need, or go in an alternate route. The Outer Worlds 2, on the other hand, sometimes has these alternate routes presented to you, but a lot of times they just have skill checks freaking everywhere that open up or close off the levels depending on what you've invested in. There's kind of an imbalance of engineering options that open up broken doors versus hacking terminals to do similar things, but it's just a routinely fun exercise to have these options alongside explosives or science checks that give you possible avenues to take out enemies easily, avoid combat altogether, or acquire otherwise inaccessible loot. And even after all that, we still have the joys of the flaw system to round out the role-playing experience. In the first game, flaws were awful. They're a negative attribute that would be offered to the player in exchange for a skill point, but the trade-off was never worth it. I compared these to Avowed's godlike powers, which are just never that good, and which seem like something to do while your actually good abilities cool down, but at least you could just accept those and then not use them if they weren't, floating your boat. The flaw system in The Outer Worlds 2 has overhauled itself and become something you absolutely want to engage in, taking it from a completely unappealing mechanic to something I couldn't get enough of. Flaws now include way more tantalizing options that merely ask you to adjust your playstyle in interesting ways instead of just hoping and praying that you never run into a bad enough situation that makes you regret the permanent changes you've made to your character. For instance, early on I spread my skill points around to more than just my 3 specializations, so the game offered me the flaw easily distracted, which meant that I could now only add skill points to whatever was the lowest non-zero skill that I had. But in return, I would get 1 more skill point per level. It wasn't letting me excel in just a couple categories, but it was essentially giving me the ability to be very good in at least 4 or 5 skills instead of just the 3 that I'd chosen right off the bat. This was the first flaw I chose, and I just kept adding them on as it just kept making the game more interesting. The flaw system is wonderfully balanced and honestly makes the game much more interesting the more you take on, as it makes you engage with the other systems all the more. Now don't get me wrong, some flaws are absolutely brutal and not recommended, like the kleptomaniac, which lets you sell stolen items for 100% more value at vendors, but makes your character randomly steal stuff so you can get in really hot water with NPCs and kind of fuck up your relationships. The flawed flaw also makes you automatically accept any flaw that you trigger based on your habitual play patterns, the trade-off being that you get an extra perk point every 5 levels, which is just not worth it, and I think is the only flaw that the game actively recommends that you do not try in a first playthrough. But all that to say, I really appreciated the depth that transformed gameplay here in The Outer Worlds in a very RPG stimulating kind of way. And I wish that Avowed had something similar, though I understand that it's a little bit more of a tactical action RPG type of game. So all of that is player-centric considerations for Avowed and the Outer Worlds 2. But let's shift our focus to the NPCs that accompany us, our faithful companions, focusing on how well they're integrated into the combat and the story, and what these two games could stand to learn from each other and how to handle their inclusions in future sequels. Now, as you may remember if you watched my Starfield Outer Worlds video, I found the Outer Worlds roster of companions rather inconsistent. Pravati's a gem, Vicar Max's transformation from gruff and dogmatic to humble and inquisitive was strong, but other than the roguish but loyal Nyoka, the rest of the squad were doofuses. Felix is one of the biggest dorks in gaming and has a very uninteresting companion quest. Ellie is the rebellious rich kid trying to be a pirate to stick it to her uncaring parents, but she often came off as an annoying tryhard. Sam the robot is funny, but at the end of the day, he's just kind of a robot. The good news is that Avowed and the Outer Worlds 2 have much better companions, though they do incidentally falter where the other game excels. In Avowed, we have Kai, a sort of sarcastic swashbuckler type that's surprisingly okay with a lot of the seedy stuff you do, but has a breaking point. Giada's a necromancer, or animancer in this world, who's passionate and loyal and someone I grew to like for her convictions. Marius is a bit too smarmy and combative at first, but his journey from exile to reconciling with his people made him a lot more likable by the end, and he ends up feeling like one of the characters in the group that can actually be both conscientious without being inflexible.
All right. Waiting for the butt.
Despite looking like a piece of bubblegum that fell onto the couch, Yatsley is actually pretty likable, bubbly and cute as a button, and has an interesting fascination with dangerous magic.
God, I love that tiny woman.
And that's it. Avowed has a nice, small roster of friends, and that's to the game's benefit because it's not spreading itself too thin, and it also makes your companions feel more organically tied to the story instead of this overly large entourage most other games go for. What's not small is their skill tree. Like you, they have a bunch of options, like Yatsley's devastating magic, Giada's awesome healing and armor options, Tamarius's shadow step ability or ability to lock enemies in place with roots, or Kai's jump and shoot stuff that never felt very good. What I found most strange was how seldom they were actually doing anything for the team. I didn't see any way to adjust their AI behavior, but I wished I could because of how seldom they actually fire off their abilities. Giada generally healed me or popped a shield, thank Wodaka, but Yatsley almost refused to do anything other than basic attacks, and she kept all of her devastating AoE abilities just in her back pocket, I guess. Most companions just do very little damage in general. I would watch them attack an enemy with almost 0 health left and they would take 4 or 5 hits to finish them off. They're not only weak, they're stupid, so they end up being even more maintenance for the player to go into the pause menu and manually spam all their abilities for them and wait for the cooldown, much as you have to do for your own abilities. They're not useless, but they mostly feel like they're just here to do things like call out when enemies are attacking you in your blind spots so you know when and where to dodge.
Coming from your right. Nice.
And speaking of speaking out, I'm surprised they don't speak to each other while out and about almost ever. The Outer Worlds' best moments were often the funny conversations that your pals had with one another. This made pairing up different people a real treat just to see what sparks would fly or what surprising commonalities that they discover. In Avowed, your companions only speak to each other when you choose to rest at a party camp fast travel point. And while limiting, the conversations that do ensue are actually pretty well done. They're not too long, and there's a lot of interplay between the characters where they try out their ideas, bicker some, and come to a more nuanced understanding of you and each other. We get to know them better through companion missions too. Even late in the main quest, we see a god tempt them with visions based on what we already know about them, and the other companions weigh in and comfort them at this time of psychological attack. At certain points in the story, they'll all chime in and you can tell they're actually friends and want this mission to work out for everyone. It's simple but effective writing, and the only thing I wish to see more of is any actual consequence to the bickering or disagreement. My companions were far too long-suffering as I committed atrocities against their very people. I also thought it was funny how Yatsley freaked out about siding with Ludwin and destroying a holy temple.
Think of all that we lost because of you and that monster.
But was totally fine destroying Solace Keep for the dwarves, which infuriated Marius.
Exactly.
The only time the narrative really bit back was when I fully committed to joining a big bad near the end, and my entire party left me to fight through a besieged city myself and take on the final boss alone. It was a great moment, but it was quite late in the game. That said, while the game contrives a few too many ways to keep us all together until the very end, at least the groundwork for strain and eventual dissolution of our partnership existed, and I truly felt that we were a close close-knit team of friends by the end. The Outer Worlds 2 has pretty good companions as well, but there's almost no acknowledgement of their vast ideological differences, and no real proof that any of them even know each other exist despite being in the same tight quarters.
This whole thing's a wash. I'm sick of it.
This is too bad because Avowed's companions are likable, though they can feel a bit like remixed tropes. On the other hand, the Outer Worlds 2 companions feel richly original and tied to this game's universe, and each represent a unique and often conflicting ideology with the others, but they're weirdly abstracted from each other in conversations. The best combatant in your party is Tristan, who's from the Protectorate, the domineering faction that almost everyone hates. My favorite companion, Marisol, is from the Order of Ascendant, who defected from the Protectorate a while ago, and who now operate as this kind of Catholic church if they acted like those guys from the Foundation TV show that think the meaning of life can be found in the perfect mathematical equation, not controlling the masses like the Protectorate does. My second favorite companion, Inez, is a genetically enhanced super soldier who works for the hyper-consumerist Andy's Choice Corporation, but who struggles with her livelihood being tied to the increasingly barbaric practices of her employer that made her who she is in the first place. Azza is a bloodthirsty cultist who worships the power of the rifts, the game's MacGuffin that are the destabilizing effects of humanity's use of lightspeed drives. Niles, a member of the space police you're a part of, has a vested interest in being above all the petty politics of these zealot factions and being a paragon of virtue due to his station. In theory, these folks who are committed to their factions should be much more at odds with each other than they ever are. Azza is a wildly silly character who just wants to kill everything in sight, and yet no one checks her or goes, "Hey, get that lunatic out of here." Not even straight-laced by the book Niles.
Our enthusiasm got the better of us. She should have suffered more.
Marisol's perfectly willing to gat anyone in sight if you push her, and Tristan can be pushed to be as unwaveringly arbitrary and unfair as you let him without any commentary from the group, and on it goes. Unlike Avowed, where all the companions are generally lone wolves who have a shared purpose and a similar distaste for most big power structures, here the very specific allegiances of the Outer Worlds 2 crew should lend themselves to bickering and infighting and tough choices between your pals, but despite the way they're constructed, promising that there's going to be a lot more fireworks later, I never saw them chat like they do in the first Outer Worlds, and they only seem to exist relative to the player. Watching them mill around the ship feels like a menagerie of your pets more than a collection of living, breathing people who might get into it if you leave them together long enough.
Damn it! I never wanted to talk about this.
It's a thoroughly strange quality for a game that seems to have these factions set up in a very Fallout New Vegas pick your poison kind of way, and yet no one really seems to be off-put by the other. Your companions are also kind of a nightmare in combat. They often strafe right in front of you, and friendly fire is a thing, so I killed them quite a bit, and they don't revive each other, so it's always up to you to pick them back up with the slow and easily interruptible help animation. Most of their abilities kind of sucked to me, so that's why I went with Inez a lot of the time, because her healing ability directly impacted my ability to preserve my rare inhaler charges. Suffice to say though, I like the companions as characters in both games, but I found their AI rather dumb and was surprised at how little they interact with each other or impact things in the Outer Worlds 2. They seem well conceived, but quite inconsistent in execution, and end up kind of being nice set dressing a lot of the time. Now, all this talk about our companions and how they interact has me realizing that we really need to start talking about one of the most important parts of our comparison and contrast, and that is the storytelling in both games and the characterization, how it manages to greatly improve upon the Outer Worlds, but has some strange misfires too. Avowed took me a while to grow on me, as its writing is full of very dry jargon and very boring conversations, and some of the conflict can feel very phoned in. Sometimes the story can feel awfully small and low budget, despite quite literally being about deciding the fate of the god Sopadal that's currently linked to you telepathically. But whereas the focused nature of not too many factions or side characters could feel too stripped back, I understand why it did for many. For me, this brevity was actually the soul of wit.
It's hard to argue, no matter how much we might want to.
Now sure, I'd have liked a less canned feeling, but I grew to appreciate this more focused take because it let me build up expectations for choices and interactions without losing track of central conflicts, because of side quest or grinding, and then have a much more trackable and rewarding sense of cause and effect as the game went on. Plenty of RPGs have better writing overall, sure, but Avowed smartly gets you to the quick of what you need to care about in a situation and says, okay, what do you want to do here, and what would you like to see happen, and then generally you get to see that happen fairly quickly. Avowed's crown jewel is a reasonable turnaround time and setup for payoff, like how Ludwig keeps showing up and just daring you to take her down as she commits atrocity after atrocity. There are even some cool choice points with her underlings along the way that can go without incident if you want, or you can become full-blown boss battles against a small army. I really love games that turn your abstract character motivation into actionable options for the player, that translates the talking head nature of what you do into, you want to say that? Okay, this is now going to happen. That becomes gameplay. So many boss fights in RPGs can just sort of feel like a perfunctory task of, we need bosses, let's contrive a situation in which we can go hit something eventually. But here, these bigger moments feel like they're of importance because I've got 4 people running with me who are locked in and have nuanced and fully expressed opinions about, say, Ludwin or the other shady characters we meet, like Marius' dysfunctional and sometimes traitorous dwarf family in Solace Keep, or the god within us that seems repentant for the evils that wrought long ago, but also a little too unpredictable to trust. There's even a god who's like us, named Sargamus. Only he sacrificed a whole expedition's worth of travelers to make it to where he can animate his own god inside of a giant robot body. We can go for godlike solidarity and let him loose, or we can wreck him for his betrayal. But the quest, the whole time, is getting me giddy for how I'm going to deal with him as I learn what's happened here. I'm excited to see where it's going to go because I can tell that I'm leaning towards fireworks. And if I let him off, that still feels really naughty that I would do that. And I'm anxious to see how my companions are going to flare up because knowing what we know, how can we let him off? That's not something I can say about a lot of RPGs that seem to be so much about the long game that they won't just go for the jugular. And it's a real benefit and focus of this concise world design, regardless of whether it's just the result of a small budget or whatever. And that's to say nothing of the cool side effects where I did a good deed and saw side characters re-emerge later in unpredictable places to help me out of a jam or to just say hey, which is a great touch. I was also pleased that the Outer Worlds 2 did this as well, as a doctor that I'd spared despite his wrongdoing showed up later in a corner doing janitorial work and thanked me for showing him the error of his ways. I could have easily just not decided to go into this random bathroom where he was amidst all the hustle and bustle of this market space. But there he was, waiting for me. Felt all the more immersive, incidental, and lifelike because of it. Back to Avowed, as cool as quest consequences can be, there are a lot of conversations in the meantime that can be a real drag. Many side characters are basically cardboard cutouts who sound like bumbling idiots, or just drown you in meaningless world jargon. It was cool I got to use my character background to inform how I spoke to people, but it didn't seem to matter much more overall than just being an extra flavor to conversation. There's some good stuff here, but it can get obscured by some very generic writing and scenarios. The Outer Worlds 2 does a much better job at making the moment-to-moment dialogue enjoyable and interesting. The sequel seems to finally figured out its tone and brevity correctly, and it makes its social commentary much more incidental and absurd than merely finger-wagging or seeming too glib about the situation.
Appreciate that. I spent decades undercover with only self-affirmations to assuage my vacillating morale.
The first game tried much too hard to be quippy and irreverent to a fault, and it never let the horror of corporations literally crunching people down into fertilizer sink in, because the characters never seemed that bothered by it. The Outer Worlds 2 isn't gloomy by any stretch, but it is moodier, and it feels like it was written by an actual team of adults, and not just people trying to mime the memes.
I mirror that sentiment, to be certain.
The Outer Worlds 2 gave me license to do wild shit like turning an official's own wayward cousin over to them so that he would be left to die in the stocks as a warning to anyone else who thought about breaking the law. Another instance is where I could have Marisol refuse to grow as a person and give in to her assassin ways to murder a woman who framed her. There's no way around how messed up that feels, even if the game doesn't belabor it too much.
Do I have to shoot up the place? Or will you come clean immediately? Who do you work for, little mole?
Interestingly, if you happen to kill a random NPC from Marisol's order, she'll threaten to leave, despite her propensity to lapse into self-righteous homicide herself.
More or less.
Outer Worlds 2 doesn't revel in suffering, but it's far less timid about showing the effects of these ideologies at play. And because of that, the humor hits way better and doesn't short-circuit the drama because it doesn't seem like the only endgame, the only show in town. Instead, it's a natural, unpreachy outflow of the flippant attitude towards human life and suffering that this world exhibits on a regular basis. We are in on the joke now, and much more participatory in it this time around. One of my favorite quest lines is trying to break up a workers' strike where the workers' rep is a normal enough guy just wanting better working conditions for his underlings, but is being wound up to say socialist propaganda by a conniving worker rep who's trying to use the situation to advance his own career.
And he's got to prioritize worker prosperity. Remind me again? An inhospitable occupational environment that ignores worker safety and health concerns. Right, that.
We need the proletariat to yield to, worker subjugation by xenophobic proxy? No, that ain't right. But it's something that sounds super fancy when Will explains it.
Right, that.
It's a smarter and more politically balanced and less one-sided cynicism this time around that acknowledges that not everyone who seems to be on your side is necessarily got your best interest in mind, even if they're saying all the right keywords. But ironically, what may undercut the game's effectiveness as, stop and think about it commentary is that it's so cozy and likable and plays like butter, perhaps to a fault. Sure, the hit detection is still off, as if the guns have bullet skip and not bullet drop where you have to aim low where you shoot over enemies' heads, but the double jump from your boosters to the mantling to weapon switching to sneaking around, all of it feels immaculate. This in tandem with the beautiful visuals, the much less noticeable but still quality soundtrack, the much better writing and voice acting and quest writing and sound design, all of it just feels like it's always working together to ensure pace and consistency. What this means is that playing The Outer Worlds 2 is a vibe that I could keep coming back to, but it also means that the game can feel as as Skill-Up put it, low stakes. It's a two-edged sword that The Outer Worlds 2 doesn't pretend to be deeper than it is, and yet does a better job than its predecessor of introducing a little edge to its social commentary without being performatively dark. What it turns into is itself, meaning the sequel feels like what The Outer Worlds 2 should have always been. Bigger, more beautiful, more self-assured, and smarter in its own vision than the previous game was. I'd almost say this game is a reboot. The flaws have been revamped to be actually desirable to have, and taking on their negative characteristics actually makes the game more interesting, not just miserable. The gunplay feels leagues better, and the writing is so much smarter and funnier. It doesn't feel like it's just preaching to the choir of people who already agree with the sort of generic anti-hypercapitalism that it's about. Obsidian finally feels more interested in making an impressive and expansive world that feels like if BioShock's individualistic, murderous tycoons were given the full farcical treatment.
All of this just works. I'm not kidding.
A big part of the reason the sequel flows so much better too is that its story is so much more compelling, at least at the outset. And I'll just go ahead and give you a big old spoiler warning right here because we do have to talk about the endings and the major plot points to really unpack how well Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2 tell their stories and what they could learn from each other. And since Avowed's story is much easier to sum up and has fewer notes for me, let's start there. The living lands are being besieged by the Dream Scourge, a plague that seems to arrive metaphysically but then has this very real, very lose-your-mind zombie implication for all those infected. You play as an envoy from the rather domineering Adarian Empire, sent to stop the plague. You've got something special about you too. You're godlike, someone whose very appearance betrays that you've got a special connection to a god and you're something of an emissary to them. But that connection doesn't manifest itself fully until you're cut down in the line of duty by an assassin, and you meet this nature god Sopadal, a god who needs your help to be freed, so they resurrect you and put you on your way. It's up to you whether you listen to Sopadal's Johnny Silverhand-inspired voice in your ear, as you find out that Sopadal is behind the Dream Scourge, a sort of unintended side effect of what they call self-defense, as their great power has threatened the other gods like Wodaka and Nandrew. Alongside that choice, we also decide whether to ally ourselves with the villainous Inquisitor Ludwin from her homeland of Adir, who seeks to kill Sopadal, but also kind of wants to kill everyone else too. Do you ally yourself with a convenient asshole to stem the bleeding of the Dream Scourge, or do you let dark magicians like Rengrim cut the plague off at its heart at the unavoidable expense of some of those connected to the Dream Scourge, hoping to save many more later? There are some interesting choices like this throughout, and some culminate into very cool, very Greedfall-esque choices to preserve natural beauty, or realize that there's a reason that we cut our grass. I chose to be a goody two-shoes my first time through and free Sopadal, and I accepted all of her gifts of power the whole way through, and it was pretty satisfying. On my second run, I decided to see what would happen if I allied myself fully with Ludwin's crappy ideas, and the first order of business was destroying an old temple that was full of important magic or something. This would cut off the influence of the Dream Scourge, much to my party's dismay. And after I determined that I would end Sopadal instead of setting her free, I fully committed to joining Ludwin's power grab, but was surprised that allying myself with her fully was the most boring ending. She kills me immediately as some kind of ultimate obeisance to Adir. But not only do you miss out on her fun boss fight if you do this, but you get maybe a paragraph of an ending and then credits. No, it's definitely still way more fun to fight for your ending, regardless of whether you're full-on baddie or not. I went in on my second run without my companions, who had pissed off by saying I was joining Ludwin in the first place, but then decided there wasn't room in this town for the two of us. So I took her out and got an amazing ending where the bittersweet victory is captured poignantly, where I get what I want, I rise to her position, and I rule with an iron fist, outlawing all worship of all but the vindictive war goddess Wodaka, who really didn't like Sopadal. But then I realize that my time is fleeting, and that those who live by the sword are certain to perish by it.
You find yourself looking over your shoulder. You wait for a knife in the back.
I found it really appealing how tight this experience is, how epic it could feel. We're dealing with super powerful gods and a plague that ravages the land, but we're wrestling with pagan gods, or the equivalent of Greek gods, which means they're petty and vindictive, not aware of their own strength or uncaring of how many they hurt. They're just humans with bigger members to swing around. Obsidian making these characters feel important without dominating the action is smart, and your actions are the ones with the most agency. It's just a little strange how long it delays the ramifications of your worst behavior until the very end, when all of your companions could finally desert you.
After all the Steel Garrote have done, you choose them. It was nice knowing you, Envoy. But I refuse to be part of this.
But it does make the previous conflicts ring a little hollow if these companions are so willing to forgo their morals for so long, just so the game can keep them by your side as combat help. But at least Avowed builds up the conflicts with its main villains so that they feel like rewards for your choices and not just boss fights. Avowed isn't as interesting on a moment-to-moment basis as the Outer Worlds 2, mind you. It can be quite repetitive. Some of its areas, while beautiful, can feel just like a bunch of empty space. Quite a few side quests lack character, but the main story can feel like a meaningfully focused tale that doesn't try to do too much and does a good job of just making its beats feel impactful, worth anticipating, and full of payoff. This is important to note because the other Obsidian folks working on the Outer Worlds 2 made a much more enjoyable moment-to-moment game, but then make the exact same missteps as the first Outer Worlds did with a main villain that pops out of nowhere, flat ending, and a feeling that all the supposed conflict between factions is just overblown, because allying yourselves with them or not doesn't really have many consequences, and it's far too easy to broker peace with them in the end if you desire. You play as a space cop, tasked with shutting off the rifts that are opening up as a result of light speed travel, not unlike the Mass Effect relays, rifts which are also threatening to destroy the universe soon, not unlike the Reapers. The plot is set in motion by a betrayer named Devrise, not unlike Saren, who messes up our mission to resolve this issue and puts us hot on her trail once we wake up 10 years later after her betrayal's fallout. No pun intended. The story definitely sags a bit as she keeps eluding us over and over again until the very end, but because the storyline seems more interested in the journey and not the destination, this isn't as distracting as it could be. We invade the important archive and get the deets on the rifts, solving puzzles to reroute power and platforming across dangerous machinery in hopes of getting the info we need. It's all a pretty cool mystery, but it doesn't quite stick the landing. The real logjam starts with the part of the story that gives you the choice of whether to side with Auntie's Choice or the Order of Ascendant or get them to work together. These factions are headed by Auntie Cleo herself and the Archbishop Ruth Bassar. I love how the Outer Worlds 2 builds up to meeting Cleo in person, and it even lets us find her robot body because in a very Mr. House-esque twist, she's not the only auntie that's ever been, but she's a literal talking head kept alive through powerful medical technology. Technology which you can sabotage if you really want to for devastating effect. But if you help her out like I did, you get a very Avowed-esque payoff where the giant personalities of this world aren't just statues or legends, but living, breathing people whose earth-changing escapades we get to be a part of. Kind of like when you get to meet Andrew Ryan or Atlas from the BioShock games. I absolutely love the opportunity that Obsidian provided me to engage in making myself a part of this world's lore and not just experience it like a museum. And if you did like I did and subverted the faction system by getting Cleo and Ruth to work together against the Protectorate so we could close those rifts, you'd think you died and gone to RPG heaven. But it's a bit of a smoke and mirrors thing, unfortunately. Despite being told these factions are far too different in their ideologies and goals to work together, or at least do so without a lot of conflict, it takes one whole conversation to get them on the same page. I failed the interaction several times, but only because I thought I had to be a mediator, perfectly acquiesced to everybody's request.
You have disappointed me immeasurably.
Don't feel bad, Commander.
What it took was a rather unintuitive choice in one place to piss someone off, which made them relent in the end. Which is strange since every other time I chose a sort of hostile, suck it up and compromise type of response, they grew tired of me, lost trust, or ended the peace talks abruptly. This piece of role-playing was just not written very well. It's narratively too simple to pull off despite the game telling me it'll be really difficult, and then it's too arbitrary in how you accomplish it with dialogue options that are rewarded inconsistently. Once you do get them together though, we are ready to marshal our forces and take back the archive, which has the info that we need in order to help close the rifts. This anticipation starts to feel like we're going to have a huge faction fight at the dam like New Vegas, and it's a pretty cool flashback feeling. But somehow I got all the way into the archives and pulled off my supposedly daring, tough mission without ever tagging in these extra troops from these factions that I'd earned. They were somehow missable. Somehow you could basically go to one of the two next objective points and they wouldn't tie together unless you went to them in a certain order. They even commented later on that it was weird that I didn't call them in for their aid, as if they were standing by and never got the call. How the game made it this easy to miss bringing, the whole point of me going such lengths to get these people to work together is beyond me. Worse, it made the whole drama of the scene fall flat, as there was no real big fight. There was just a couple enemies here and there that wouldn't require a small army to take down. It was just piss easy to do by myself. I seriously faced almost no opposition. Maybe it's a technical limitation, but I'm amazed at how many times fights feel this small. You maybe fight 5 to 6 enemies at a time, and fights are over before you know it many times, especially near the end of the game. It's really easy to die early on, and obnoxiously so, but by the 15 to 20 hour mark of this, I would say 30 to 40 hour game, 5 to 6 enemies is just a warm-up, not a showdown. And as if that wasn't unfulfilling enough, what really sinks this narrative for me is how thrown together the ending feels yet again. The rifts are our MacGuffin, and it makes sense that we've got to stop these things and save the universe, and I like that as a motivation. It's certainly way better than that Fallout-like crap with the Rick and Morty knockoff from last time, but I'm amazed at how Obsidian pulls the same stunt of never really selling that there's a tangible villain out there responsible for any of this, or at least responsible for getting in our way and complicating the situation. The scene is set masterfully by finding out the rifts are rematerializing what they've sucked into them, even regurgitating people's souls in ghostly forms. It's pretty unnerving, and it makes our mission even more gut-wrenching as we have to put them back in Pandora's box, because there's no way to really help these echoes of real people, despite how messed up that may feel. This level even looks incredible with all the floating debris and the rifts glowing menacingly in the near reaches of space. It's a great scene. Yet again though, a guy we know very little about shows up in the third act of the story, and is somehow who we're supposed to care about as our final obstacle. At least Chairman Rockwell is seen a couple of times before we thwart him, and he gives us an idea of his plans. We hear about the Protectorate in the sequel a good bit, but it's all very abstract. They suck and no one likes them because they're mean and domineering. But the worst real personal impact that we get of that is from Tristan, a guy who can repent of his protectorateness and whose worst quality is being unreasonable. He's also kind of an exception to the idea that all the Protectors are just a bunch of assholes because he's an arbiter, who are sort of these self-appointed, sets his own rules and follows the dogma as best he sees fit anyway. He's not exactly having to work with the rest of the guys and really be held accountable in the same way.
That's a wise path.
Unlike Avowed, which does an excellent job at letting you know exactly who the bad guys are and giving you repeat encounters with them, the Steel Garrote and Inquisitor Ludwin, The Outer Worlds 2 just kind of leaves this soupy, almost you'd forget they're even there, bad guy in the distance, who just sort of gets a face put to it at the very end. And it's a guy whose name I couldn't even tell you off the top of my head, except now that I've looked at it, it's Emery Thoreau, whoever that is. And he gets in our way and tries to say, hey, actually, we're going to go through with this, we're going to fuck everything up by using the rest the way we want to, and you've got to hope to convince him otherwise. See, we've acquired a rift modulator that lets us close the rifts, but it requires us to be right near the rifts to start a chain reaction which will take us all with it. So we have this dilemma, and this makes up the two-stage encounter with the big bad. Now he's voiced wonderfully by the same actor who voiced Vicar Max in the first game. I'm very pleased with the performance and the writing in and of itself, but holy shit, this could have been done much better.
It cannot be!
No matter how much dirt you find in this facility to change his mind, or how much persuasive help you get from Auntie Cleo and Ruth, or your companions, you cannot avoid a boss fight with this guy unless your speech level is up to 20. Now I had the easily distracted flaw, like I said, that meant I had to diversify my skill points a lot, so perhaps this would have just been an easy skill for me to get this high, as I tend to make my speech the highest skill first and foremost, because it's the most useful. But I was about 14 speech by this point, and nowhere had the game required anything higher of me, so it felt like the skill plateau that I needed. Not so here. That's not a crime, and I appreciate it being much harder to pull this off and say the truce between Ruth and Auntie Cleo that requires no skill checks and just unclear dialogue options, but it felt a little weird that it was this much harder than every other hard encounter in the game, and that there's no other way to achieve this end. Weirdest of all, even if you get past the boss fight, which is nothing particularly special, you still have the same choice regardless. You or the party member that you volunteer stay behind, driving the ship into the rifts and sacrificing themselves to save the day.
Wait, you're not serious, are you?
Very Mass Effect 2 feeling, like who survives in the end, except now it's your choice. And it's a cool idea, but the same outcome is effectively happening. Only you get a less interesting tagline at the end if you sacrifice yourself somehow. So not only do we have a villain who's just kind of a last-minute figurehead that we didn't even know we really needed, the real villain, the rifts themselves, are defeated the same way regardless of anything you do, and the only real variable is a couple cinematics that are essentially name swaps of either you died or X party member died. And the ending slideshow fails to emphasize most most of your grandest deeds and focuses a lot more on random side characters that you saw for maybe 5 minutes and may not even remember. It's such a strange feeling to be in love with a game like The Outer Worlds 2 for so long, and then have it commit the same error as its predecessor but worse and kind of deflate the experience. Obsidian just seems like they're sort of messing around in their absurdist world yet again, not really knowing what the purpose is or how to make a story really land. Now, it's a much better hook and MacGuffin this time around, with much more likable characters accompanying you, much more interesting and vibrant worlds to explore, far better controls and gun feedback, and way better writing that balances its dark humor and drama because it knows it's a video game and not an Upton Sinclair novel. It's just fun and likable, and it's the rare RPG of its kind that you'd want to pick up and play just because of its game feel. But it's a bit disheartening that it loses so much steam by the end and seems incapable of making the world feel as full of conflict as it pretends to promise with all the different factions, different ideologies at play.
Which is distressing.
Longtime enemy factions can be brought together on a whim, and somehow can be accidentally left behind after all that work, and yet it doesn't matter because the mission was so easy their help wasn't needed anyway. Your companions, likable as they can be, never quite go beyond likable personality but dumb combat companion. As the stark contrast, their moralities never break out into verbal or physical altercations, and they never seem to interact with each other like the NPCs did in the first Outer Worlds. Remember how Legolas and Frodo famously never speak to each other in the Lord of the Rings trilogy? That's how these companions all feel to each other. They only orbit around you, and it's as if they're unaware of their companion's existence. Even asking them to commentate on the other party members falls flat because they have such lukewarm takes. Avowed avoids this problem by having a group of loners grow to appreciate each other's differences, and they become this tight-knit group, but they also have less diametrically opposed views in the first place. Outer Worlds sets up a world full of factions, zealotry, and then gives you avatars of each that would seem to imply that we're going to have, a butting of heads between these things, a bearing out of their ideas, and either a lot of blow-up fights, or maybe they find out that they're more alike than they thought. But no such encounters ever happen. Avowed takes a little bit too long to give you any tangible change to gameplay as a result of party conflict, but it eventually happens. The most you can do in The Outer Worlds 2 seems to be pissing off someone by killing too many NPCs from their faction, despite the fact that you're asking them all to hang out on your shit with people that you'd probably be at each other's throats in either context. Fallout New Vegas had a similar trajectory to Avowed, only losing your party if you really chose to be a baddie at the very end. Generally speaking, you really only lost access to the other quest factions in New Vegas once you get really deep into one faction, right? Certainly there were casualties of your choices, but it was gradual, and you could kind of feel it happening, and you could take a step back if you'd like, or maybe even reload a save if you just didn't want to ally yourself and lose that traction with another faction. But the difference between Vegas and The Outer Worlds 2 is that you feel the tension and actual gameplay disappear as a result of your actions. In Vegas, but not the other. Outer Worlds 2 talks a big game, but is ultimately very afraid to ever make the consequences of your actions feel too weighty. Even the flaw system, as fun as it is, might actually be too forgiving, too lacking in friction, too overcorrected in favor of the player from the rather crappy versions in the original. I can't say I'm too worried about it because it's just way more fun, but from the perspective of the designers and the longevity of this idea being anything more than just sort of people-pleasing, I wonder if there was an even better way to do it. But even after all these misgivings about how these games shaped up, I really can't say I didn't enjoy the heck out of them, at least in the part where it counts.
Are you being serious right now?
Avowed is a breath of fresh air when it comes to action RPG combat. There's a Dragon's Dogma-esque freedom in how your build can branch out as you please and not be confined by class type. If you've got points to spend, choose whatever discipline you want, and any combo of melee weapons, guns, and magic can go to town. Now, I do echo Skillup's criticism that Obsidian's way too stingy with the upgrade points to ever get quite enough of the abilities you'd want to play with in one playthrough, and that can make the game extra repetitive as you can only span the same couple of abilities over and over. And the small cast of characters isn't always compelling. I know random NPCs are pretty boring, but there are some highlights, like the godlike Sargamus, to the get stuff done sorcerer and Ringram, to the Dia de los Muertos fascist and Ludwin. The Outer Worlds 2 unfortunately deflates a lot of my enthusiasm for it by having a really flat ending, but I can't act like the previous 30 or so hours weren't thoroughly beautiful and smooth playing. It was often so cozy that it just kept me there for hours. The writing feels mature without giving up its playfulness, and it, alongside the art direction, finally gives the Outer Worlds the identity it so desperately needed. Are Avowed and Outer Worlds 2 still a bit crimped in scope and execution? Sure, and I can agree with the spirit of what the haters are saying, where it feels like there's some easy wins here that weren't capitalized on, but there are so many more small victories that really add up. The Outer Worlds isn't even a bad game, it just makes its limitations rather obvious at times, and they're kind of distracting and a little unfulfilling. Avowed and the Outer Worlds 2 are leaps and bounds better, sometimes very literally, and they show a lot of improvement across the board.
Right? Wasn't I just saying?
I do wish they traded notes, though. Both of their combat models are good, if their companions are a little dumb. I do think Avowed would have benefited from Outer Worlds 2's emphasis on character build mattering how you interact with the world, other than combat. There are no real skill checks except ones that check attributes and conversations. Obviously, Avowed has other goals, and they're much more about, the physicality of what you're doing. But I guess it's just me recognizing how cool it was that the Outer Worlds 2 has so many little places to use your skills, like fixing robots, or hacking this thing, or creating a potion that does something later on, or creating multiple routes to get to a thing and all of that. The exploration is still quite fun in these games, and leagues better than the lane running of the Outer Worlds. I do wish Obsidian hadn't just resorted to vent crawling so much in Outer Worlds 2, and kept in a more Avowed style of platforming that the game had early on, but, what are you gonna do? As for their stories, I'd say the Outer Worlds has a much more interesting hook, but it does get less interesting as it goes, and Avowed actually does the opposite. Avowed's narrative pays off much better, even if it has much more skippable dialogue, and kind of a hokey Critical Role cheesiness at times.
So close, but yet so far.
But if you smash these games together, I think you'd get an incredible Obsidian RPG for 2025, and not just two pretty good ones. Ultimately, I made this video because I'd seen Avowed get savaged all year by a cynical gamer community, and some of it is relatable jadedness.
For all we know, you're one of those sick bastards.
I don't like how many games these days feel contrived and fake and thin, and just sort of like a set of assets that you move through and just do the same played out things you've done in boring open worlds with a bunch of action RPG bullshit that's just there to pad out the game. But in the spirit of fairness to the fun that you can have with Avowed and the Outer Worlds 2, I think Avowed is worth at least one run through, and maybe more considering that Obsidian's adding quarterstaffs for magic users and a new game plus mode in early 2026 that can really let you dig into the rest of those skills that I'd hope we get to see more of in a one playthrough. The Outer Worlds 2 is 90% of the perfect feeling Outer Worlds experience, and that's hard to whine too much about. I had a great time playing these games, even if I feel they could have learned a bit from each other and be even better. But they do show clear improvement, and there's absolutely fun to be had here. And not just fun in spite of shortcomings, but because of the very formula that people have ragged on to the point of excess. Sometimes brevity is the soul of wit. Obsidian's 2025 RPGs are just like cold pizza after all. Even when they're not as hot and fresh out of the oven as they could be, they're still quite good because their core ingredients are so delicious.
It's finally time. I shall soon be reborn into perfection. Thank you for bringing me here.
I'm glad to play games like these, and I'm excited to see Obsidian grow and get better at their craft. I know the director of The Outer Worlds 2 is aware that they could be like CD Projekt Red someday in terms of detail and scope and reactivity, and like he says, maybe one day they'll get there. So let's hope that day comes because Obsidian gets closer with each passing day. So yeah, that's my 2025 recap of a sort for you, and I want to thank you for showing up for me all year, and I hope you have a great holiday season.
Suppose this is where I leave you then. I owe you my life, Envoy. I won't soon forget what you did.
And if you're getting sentimental this time of year and want to spread some holiday cheer, consider joining these folks over at Patreon, YouTube, or Coffee, or any other place that accepts good old greenbacks. I have to give a big shout out to the people who have supported me for so long. I'm talking about Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Yaksho, BBF and Bloxburg, Melancholy Geek, and Luke Dudney. And an extra special thanks to the Nth Review and James Wyatt for subscribing to my highest tiers. Even though it may not seem like a lot in the scheme of things, it not only is it super encouraging for me, but it is a big help for somebody who kind of does this full time and is just on the grind right now. So can't tell you how much that means on a regular basis for me to have that support from you guys, both in terms of just what you watch, like, share, and in some cases, financially contribute. It's all a great big help, not just financially, but psychologically and just in terms of the joy of creating stuff for other people to see. And if you want to join these guys, you can subscribe for as little as $3. There's a $5 tier and a $10 tier that Nth and James Wyatt are a part of, and they all have their specific bonuses to them. So check that out at Patreon. But also realize that I ran a little poll a little while ago, and about 100 of you or so said that if I had a $1 tier, you'd be down for that. Well, for a limited time, I've got that option available for you. go for it. It's available, and it'll get you a behind-the-scenes look at what's upcoming and all that good stuff. And with that, have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in 2026 where we're going to mix it up. I know I said that last year and then I chickened out, but next year is the year that has broken the camel's back. One of the reasons you haven't seen a whole lot of me recently is because I've been doing a lot of channel research about where I want to go and what this channel needs to kind of refocus and know what it's about. So we're going to get freaky with our bad selves. So see you next year. God bless you, everyone. Thanks for watching.